All right, guys, so good evening. I want to welcome you to our respiration workshop. I'm Dr. Tiffany, most of you know, one of the chiropractors here at Liberation. This workshop is special because it's actually the first one in a series of workshops we plan to have covering one of our 7 homeostatic essentials. So we've actually not done that before. When we realized we had not done that, we were like, what are we doing? So we're going to start with respiration this evening. I'm going to cover a couple things about mechanics of breathing and how we get air in properly, and then Dr. Jordan and Dr. Mike will cover some different topics related to respiration when they come up. All right, so let's start with what respiration is. A lot of times we hear the words respiration and breathing intermixed, but breathing is actually the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. Respiration, though, is the transfer of gases from lungs to blood and the cellular production of energy within our body. So just surface level, for respiration, we pull air into the lungs, oxygen and carbon dioxide get exchanged so that we get blood vessels transporting oxygen throughout our body with hemoglobin. So breathing itself should be primarily driven by the diaphragm. That's a big dome-shaped muscle in your abdomen right under your lungs. The diaphragm is going to contract so that we pull air into the lungs. We're increasing the volume of your lungs so that the pressure inside is lower than the pressure outside, and that air wants to move in. And then the diaphragm is going to relax to push the air back out, essentially by decreasing the volume of your lungs. Under exertion, though, so like when we are climbing a mountain or running a marathon, right, the things we do every day, our accessory muscles, like the internal and external intercostals and some of our neck muscles, will join in to help so that we can get better movement in our thoracic cavity to pull in air and out. But we shouldn't need those extra muscles to do a lot of the work whenever we are at rest or not doing big activity. So we can categorize breathing into dysfunctional breathing and proper breathing. When you are breathing in a dysfunctional pattern, one of the things is mouth breathing. And that's a problem because your mouth doesn't moisten air like your nose would. Your nose also has little hairs in it that filter out particles in the air so that the air is a little cleaner when it comes into your lungs. With mouth breathing too, when we take away the chance for air to pass through our sinuses, we're not getting some of the nitric oxide that is produced in our sinuses, which is vital for cardiovascular function. The next portion of dysfunctional breathing is breathing with your chest. That's recruiting those accessory muscles to help open your chest so that you can get air in. That overworks those muscles more than they're supposed to be worked. Poor posture is another sign of dysfunctional breathing, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But also fast, shallow breathing. Oh, hey, we have a question.
Should I stop shaving my nose hairs?
Yeah, that's your problem. Now you know. So fast, shallow breathing is another form of dysfunctional breathing that allows us to get less air in. And then congestion. So sometimes our dysfunctional breathing is not our fault. If we're congested, we are forced to use the mouth to breathe. And then overinflation of the lungs happens when we are shallow breathing. So our diaphragm is not fully expanding the lungs and closing off our thoracic cavity. So what we should be doing when we breathe properly is breathing with our diaphragm. So that means we have to expand our abdomen. So breathe down, our abdomen is going to expand. And we need to breathe through our nose, which is hard if you have allergies or anything like that, and that's something to practice. It'll take a couple of days, especially if you're not used to consistently nose breathing. It'll take a few days for your nose to really clear out, but it will clear out so that you can breathe efficiently through your nose. Breathing should be rhythmic. We want it to be the same every time. We want our exhale, so the breathe out, to be longer than breathing in. And then, of course, proper posture. So here are some conditions associated with poor breathing. We can have increased stress, heart disease, sleep disorder, upper respiratory conditions, development anomalies in our facial and cranial bones. We can have mood disorders, inflammation, GI disorders, mental health issues, adrenal fatigue, dominance of your sympathetic nervous system, and a weakened immune system. So I like this list because this is something that can be caused all by improper breathing. But let's say at the very minimum, your breath or breathing pattern only causes sympathetic nervous system dominance. Okay, well, when we have that, we are in a fight or flight state. We have a racing heart, we have high blood pressure, we are, constantly feeling like we're being chased by a bear, right? So when you have that sympathetic dominance, your GI system is slowed down. You're not digesting food because your body doesn't think that you have time for that. Another is heart disease. When our heart is constantly racing, we're constantly under that physiological stress, we're creating stress on our heart. So even if it's not directly caused by your breathing, it's still going to be a trickle-down effect on those other conditions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So can you explain the facial development anomalies?
So that is a little more nuanced. I'm not a professional with that, but things like a tongue tie, right? A tongue tie will change your breathing pattern because it can pull your tongue back into the airway, causing the need to jut the chin. But it also can pull the teeth certain ways. Lip ties can gap the teeth. Yeah. All the cranial bones can be affected with that too. Okay. So I told you we'd get to the postural effects of breathing. So poor posture perpetuates, dysfunctional breathing. So I like to be interactive. I want you all to roll your shoulders in and fold forward. Now try to take a deep breath. You can't do it. It's really hard. You feel that pressure down there. Your diaphragm wants to move, but it cannot. With forward head posture and rounded shoulders, as in the first picture here, your lungs cannot fully inflate. So you're actually cutting off the use of the top third of your lungs. Wow. And your diaphragm can't move freely, and those accessory muscles are being stretched in ways that they shouldn't be. So especially, you can look at the neck muscles, the SCMs, and the other neck muscles there are not going to be able to move appropriately. This also can play a part, we talked about mood disorders. So if you've ever seen a person with depression, they typically fold in anyway because of their depressed state. But if they're folded in, they're not getting a full breath. And that's just creating that cycle of the mood disorder with improper breathing. In addition to this, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, is the nervous system's effects from improper breathing. So we have two main nerves that we want to talk about. The first is the phrenic nerve. It's mainly driven by the C4 spinal nerve, but it has contributions from C3 and C5, so your whole mid-cervical area affects this. But it provides that motor drive to contract and relax the diaphragm. So that means, number one, if we've got a subluxation in the mid-cervical spine, we know the nerve function is decreased to our diaphragm, and just getting adjusted is going to help us fight that one component of it. We also have the vagus nerve. It's not like Vegas, like slot machines. It is a cranial nerve that comes from your brainstem, and this gives that parasympathetic innervation to our organs. So the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest system, is the portion of our autonomic nervous system that focuses on reproduction and digestion. So when we have issues here, we're not allowing our organs to function normally like they should, but we also cannot get into a rest state, so we stay in that sympathetic dominant space and then have heart disease and mood disorders and all those things. The vagus nerve is interesting too because it can affect drop attacks. If you've ever heard of a vasovagal syncope attack, that's where someone just, for some reason they don't know, passes out or blacks out. And one of the things that we tell people to do when they're having those attacks is to gargle or sing, because vibration in the throat stimulates the vagus nerve because it comes down from our brainstem to our organs and then back up. But you can also nasal breathe to stimulate that nerve. And I already said gargling. But so since it is originating from the brainstem, Our upper cervical spine affects the vagus nerve. So when you get adjusted there, we're helping regulate tone of that nerve. So how do we go from dysfunctional to functional? I like to not only give a problem, but also a solution. We want to, number one, practice functional breathing. That is making sure that you check in with yourself, take a nice deep breath into your abdomen, help strengthen your diaphragm. And like I said before, it may take some days for it to feel normal because we can stay congested in our nasal cavity. You also want to practice the rhythm of proper breathing. You can count, inhale for 6, exhale for 8, and then adjustments in home therapies. When our spine moves well, all the joints out from our spine move well. That's why we talk about, shoulder, elbow, ribs, knees. If you don't correct the spine first, those are still going to move improperly. So the same for ribs. And then one of the last ones is check in with your breath and posture so that you can teach yourself to be more aware for more of your time. Whenever you get to a place where you don't have to think about breathing is when you know your breathing is functional. And working on your breath during your awake hours is going to help regulate your breathing during your sleep too. So if that's a problem, that will help resolve itself. Okay, so Dr. Jordan is going to take over now.
All right, guys. Picking up the second half, or the second third of this workshop. My name's Dr. Jordan Moore, and we have the breathing part of respiration, but we also have the cellular component. And so I'll be going through what happens inside the veins and the capillaries after we breathe in the oxygen, and what happens to the waste products that come from cells all within the body. And once we breathe in, a nice big healthy breath, we'll take the oxygen in the capillary beds inside something called the alveoli, or this is an alveolus, in the lungs, and we'll take that oxygen through the capillary into the heart. And clean, healthy breaths are important for making the most of each breath. Clean, healthy breaths are ideal for helping make sure the alveoli are effective in what they're doing. So COPD, asthma, things like that will hinder your ability to absorb oxygen. So in a lot of these cases, you see oxygen starvation symptoms, and they'll tend to produce more red blood cells, things like that, to adapt. But our body's really smart. I want to make a point on this workshop to mention that our body is self-regulating and self-healing. A lot of what we call diseases are actually our body adapting to things and our lifestyle and interferences that we've caused. So our body's doing the correct thing most of the time. It's just a matter of letting our body do its thing while we adapt our lifestyle back to what it should be. So the kidneys are an important organ for recognizing when we need more oxygen. So the cells within the kidney will recognize hypoxia or deficient oxygen within the cells and release a hormone called erythropoietin, which goes to red blood cells, or red bone marrow within the bone to produce more red blood cells. And let's see.
So is there symptoms of that?
Of hypoxia?
Like when that happens with the kidneys?
It's a normal thing. So every day your kidneys are, every day your kidneys are constantly monitoring the oxygen level and sending, the appropriate level of erythropoietin. We all create that hormone.
Okay.
But the red blood cell itself. So biconcave disc, that's its shape, and it's to increase the surface area and allow more components which are adapted to hold on to the oxygen and release it where needed. So we don't have a nucleus. The red blood cell has something called heme groups, and each heme group is capable of holding up to 4 oxygens. And the red blood cell lives for about 120 days, and it takes about 60 seconds for a red blood cell to make it from the lungs to its destination back up to its lungs, or to the lungs. And for every molecule of oxygen that we use, we produce a CO2 as a byproduct. So we need to offload that oxygen and pick up that CO2 and bring it back up to the lungs to release on our breath out. Red blood cells can also dilate arteries. This was interesting to me. So if red blood cells having a hard time in an area and things are kind of getting backed up, they can release several different compounds here, ATP, nitric oxide, L-arginine, an amino acid, S-nitrosothiols, and hydrogen sulfide, just a bunch of different chemicals that can increase the diameter of the artery to allow more blood to a certain area. Now, in the heart, you have 4 different chambers in the heart. You have 2 atrium and 2 ventricles, and the heart's responsible for bringing in the deoxygenated blood, pumping it to the lungs, and it comes back to the left atrium after it picks up oxygen and propels the force down into the rest of the body. And we all know that the heart has its own dedicated nerve supply as well as the lungs. And the heart is supplied parasympathetically, or our nerves that are responsible for maintaining more of a rest digest state, and sympathetically, which is more of our fight or flight state, through the vagus nerve and the T1 through T5 area of the spine, respectively. And what happens when we're in a sympathetic dominant state? So having a subluxation or having some kind of interference in a specific area of the spine, whether you're cutting off some vagus nerve flow or increasing the sympathetic nerve flow, can put you more in a stressed state. And in a stressed state for the heart, it's going to adapt, and if it thinks you're running away from a tiger, or just not meeting a deadline for work, it's going to increase the speed and the volume of the blood that it pumps. It's going to meet the oxygen demands, which they might not even be there in the first place. Over time, you can develop things like muscular hypertrophy in the heart, so the muscle will increase in the left ventricle down there to pump blood harder and faster to the rest of the body. And if in the right conditions, it's needed, but if it's due to something like an over-sympathetic dominant state, it can get pretty dangerous. Now, as we pump the blood out, we will eventually make it to capillaries. And these are the single cell layer thick vessels which allow oxygen and nutrients to come out and the carbon dioxide and waste products, the cellular debris and stuff like that, back in before heading back up to the heart. And really interestingly, Dr. Tiffany had brought up as we were preparing for the workshop, those that work out and those that use a specific muscle more often than not will develop more capillary beds within the muscle. And those which do the opposite, so those who sit down or are recovering from a surgery, would be a good example, that are immobile for 2 weeks in a joint or in a muscle, will have the capillary beds diminish. So they'll get less oxygen, which when it comes to a surgery is not something you want, right? If you have a damaged tissue and you're trying to rehab and repair, motion's going to be your friend. Motion's going to be good. I know it's an old school way of thinking, but sometimes they'll actually keep you immobile, ACL surgery, things like that for several weeks at a time. Makes PT that much harder. And the actual process is, just have a picture here. It gets a little bit more in depth here. We have an increased pressure at the beginning of the capillary and a negative pressure on the outside. So these are your cells that want the oxygen. You have the capillary bed here, and because the pressure's higher in the beginning of the capillary and lower in this fluid, you'll have a net pressure out of the capillary. So the good blood is getting pushed out of the capillary. Toward the end, you have a negative net pressure because the pressure stays the same on the outside here. And so the waste products and all that will be picked up before heading right back up to the heart. Now, the process of cellular respiration. It happens in 3 stages. You have glycolysis, TCA or the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. If you went through biology in high school, I think they might have touched on it briefly. If you had biochemistry in undergrad, you're pretty familiar with this and probably hated this as well. But with adequate oxygen, you're allowed to take glucose through these processes and create ATP, which is, we can call it the cell's currency or the energy for the cells themselves. And the cells need ATP to function normally. And if you don't have adequate oxygen, whether that's through intense exercise or some kind of disease, you'll produce lactic acid. And they used to think lactic acid was the cause of muscle soreness. I think there's still a lot of debate about that. I think lactic acid has a lot of protective effects in the body as well. So it is good. Exercise, the lactic acid produced from exercise is good for you, but this is the process of the actual cell breathing. Any questions on this? Well, yeah, we could talk for hours on this, but so pretty much everyone goes through this process here. If you have adequate oxygen, which is the normal, you'll go through the electron transport chain, which produces, I believe it's 95% of the ATP that the cell needs. And I want to talk more about arteries before talking a little bit about the diseased state of arteries. So I want to mention that arteries themselves have a muscular layer. Capillaries don't, they're single cell layer thick, but arteries themselves do. They have a dedicated nerve supply and blood supply. So there's arteries running into arteries, so to speak. And the heart pumps, but the arteries do as well. So as the heart pumps, the arteries should be working with it to squeeze the blood further. If the arteries, for some reason, whether that's hardening or a buildup of plaque, decide to not work as well, you'll have an increase in blood pressure. You'll still have that same demand for oxygen, but the heart needs to make up for what the arteries aren't doing as effectively. And I want to talk about arterial sclerosis. Atherosclerosis in this image is an example of arterial sclerosis. And can anyone tell me where the cholesterol is located? Really tough question here. It's the yellow part. And if you notice, it's inside the innermost layer of cells of the artery. So what this should tell you is it's the blood supply to the arteries that are having some type of issue. And is it a buildup of cholesterol, or is the cholesterol something else? So more and more research is pointing to inflammation as the cause of atherosclerosis, and we've been blaming the plaque, or we've been blaming the cholesterol for so long for something that the chronic inflammation was causing. I have here, to blame cholesterol is like blaming the water inside of a sinking ship for the situation that a massive hole has created. And as a result of the cholesterol being labeled as the culprit, we've decided to attack LDL. Everyone knows the debate, LDL, HDL, cholesterol, and we decided to attack LDL as a result. So LDL and HDL, first of all, are not cholesterol. They're lipoproteins. So your body will create LDL and HDL as needed to use the cholesterol. And let's see, those with a higher demand for cholesterol will have a higher LDL level. And so when I mentioned earlier that the body is self-regulating and self-healing, the body needs cholesterol for vitamin D, bile acids, steroid hormones, and cellular membranes. And if you take a drug to lower the ability to transfer cholesterol, eventually your body is going to have to adapt. Your body will eventually create more and more LDL to accompany the drug taken to limit it. And it tends to be a vicious cycle. So the drug I'm thinking of in particular is a statin. Most commonly prescribed drug in America, and it's meant to lower the transportation of cholesterol within the body. And most people don't know, but 25% of the body's total cholesterol is found within the brain. So we lose the ability to use the cholesterol for these functions here. Statins also block a process of cholesterol that involves decalcification of the arteries. So taking a statin will further the atherosclerosis mentioned earlier. And it does it through keeping vitamin K1 from being converted to K2. And to still recommend statins based on labeling LDL as the culprit, I mean, our body's producing the LDL, so it has a function. Yes?
I apologize if you're going to cover this, but just in case you don't, you guys see on that where the cholesterol turns into bile acids, right? Bile salts. One thing that's been known for a long time is when people get their gallbladder removed, that you can pretty much expect within about 5 years that you're going to have high cholesterol. And the reason why is right there what you're seeing, because it just changed the demand because you no longer have your gallbladder to store the bile salts.
Yeah, and if good point. If you look up, if you just YouTube statins cause heart disease, There's a lot of prominent physicians and people making a name for themselves, specifically cardiologists, who are saying, I can't prescribe statins to everyone until I understand their situation.
So for someone who's had their gallbladder removed, they take bile salts and digestive enzymes. Does that kind of help the whole cholesterol situation?
It'll help that process, yeah, for sure, for sure.
What about, is it red yeast rice or red rice yeast?
Red yeast extract, do you know much about it?
Is that,
I know it works.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly the process.
I don't know
It
the
does
process
work?
either.
it's okay?
Oh yeah, I mean it's
For
the
what?
most commonly
For what?
used
Instead of taking
natural supplement for getting rid
Instead
of
of
for
taking
lowering
what?
Instead
cholesterol.
of taking a statin or something.
Oh, okay.
But I want to move on now to blood pressure. What is high blood pressure? Is there a number? Right, and no one. They keep changing it every 7 years at their convention that they have, where they meet and talk about the new numbers. They were lowering and lowering the number for a little while, and I think they might have bumped them back up. What do they say? 120 over 80, or 120 over 60? Yeah, 120 over 80. My thing is unhealthy blood pressure a disease or a symptom? So why? No one asked the question, why is our blood pressure raised right now? And increase in blood pressure is your body adapting. We've discussed your body self-adapting, self-regulating. It's what we adapt to that could be your problem. So I want to put in the next little sentence here, imagine you go to your doctor's office. They're probably cold. You're in a little pain. You're there for pain, so you're taking an NSAID. Pain itself also raises blood pressure. It's allergy season, so you're on a decongestant. You're a little emotionally stressed. You didn't sleep the night before, so sleep apnea as well. And you had a cup of coffee, so caffeine. All these things raise your blood pressure. And when you're getting your blood pressure taken, a lot of times they'll talk to you. Also raises your blood pressure. So figuring out why we have a heightened blood pressure, if you take a blood pressure of someone who just ran sprints, it's going to be elevated because the body demanded more oxygen. So you can't put them on a statin and say they're doing the right thing. And I think Healthline actually said a 24-ounce soft drink causes an average of 15-point increase in the systolic reading and 9-point increase in the diastolic, or the systolic is when contracting the left ventricle, and then the diastolic is the relaxation. But a good book on the right here, The Great Cholesterol Myth, written by a medical doctor and a PhD, and I guess they revised it since I've read it, but it discusses how not everyone with high blood pressure should be on a statin. And there's other great physicians, Dr. Perlmutter, Dr. Ben Lynch. There's several prominent physicians now distancing themselves from the statins. I want to talk about a better indicator of heart health, and there's several inflammatory proteins that you can test and inflammatory indicators, but we need to address the inflammation, not the cholesterol level. And so one specific one, and everyone online was like, ask your doctor as you're getting your blood test to also test for C-reactive protein. It's a much better indicator of heart health. I know calcium scores are also pretty common for the healthy community, so you can see actually the calcification levels in the arteries also. Any questions on those? The last three slides.
What's a good thing to take if you have a high CRP?
Will you be addressing the artery cleansing or arteries?
Somewhat.
Okay. He knows a lot more. I know nattokinase, right? Nattoserozymes are a good option for helping clean out the blood. I know also soluble fiber is a very, very good, a happy, healthy diet.
Basically, the answer is anything that reduces systemic inflammation,
Well,
which, yes, I'll be covering some of that stuff.
removing the inflammation from, your diet or
Yeah.
habits too.
So there's nothing singular that you just take to, lower your C-reactive protein level. It's really that systematic approach.
There's no magic pill.
Yeah.
There's not a pill for an ill. Yeah. I want to address causes of inflammation. And so this image here on the left, hypercoagulated blood, or you have blood with something called fibrin binding them together. And then on the right, you have healthy blood, so to speak. So you can see on the right, you have a lot more surface area of the cells. You have a lot more oxygen exchange ability. On the left, it's obviously an unhealthy person, right? So that person will have a higher demand for oxygen and request more from the heart, more from the arteries as well. Causes of improper blood flow, so causes of inflammation. Real easy subjects here are heavy metals, sedentary lifestyle, cigarette smoke, chronic stress, and dehydration all will trigger inflammation. Less talked about are consumption of too many polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are your oils that aren't supposed to be oils. I mean, vegetable oil, canola oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, any oil that's, I'm not going to say liquid at room temp. There are some good options, but most of the oils that go rancid in the body that aren't meant to be oils in the first place. The consumption of canola oil, for instance, has increased by 900% in the last 20 years. Canola oil comes from something called rapeseed. Not too good of a name though, rapeseed oil. So named it Canada or.
So canola and grapeseed, same thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's Canada oleic acid, right? Canadian. Or it's what did you say? Grapeseed.
Did you say that canola oil and grapeseed are the same thing?
Rapeseed.
Who?
Rape.
Grape without the G. Yes.
Yes.
What is that?
That's what canola oil is.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the smell of processing these oils is so terrible that they have to increase them to really high temperatures to burn off the unattractiveness of the oil. So also another reason why they go rancid. Mm-hmm.
So what would be your top main 3 oils to use?
All I use is butter, personally. Coconut oil is great. Coconut oil is good.
What about olive oil?
Olive oil's good. You just don't want to get it smoking. So when it smokes, it's going rancid. And in other words, consumption of oxidized fats and sugars, which cause inflammation, is spearheading our #1 cause of death in the United States. And to show you, the science is not out. Got a ton of research here. There's new stuff. There's new research coming out all the time. And I want to address real quick the reason why a lot of foods are labeled fat-free and healthy is because of a study from, I think it was 1970s. Ansel Keys, a psychologist, did a study of several, it was like 20 or 30 different nations. And he had a hypothesis going into the study that consumption of saturated fats causes heart disease. And Eisenhower, who just had a heart disease, was real interested in this guy and this study. And so he took the results of this study, which out of those 20 nations, he picked 7 to fit his hypothesis. So he picked the 7 studies where they consumed a lot of saturated fats and was like, that's it, they cause heart disease. And Eisenhower took it, and so a lot of the agencies, the American Heart Association was making a name for itself, for instance, got a lot of funding to help promote heart healthy, everything like that. And so specifically Honey Nut Cheerios, heart healthy, you see it on every commercial, it's grains, sugars, right? It's
All the stuff to stay away from.
right, it's what we should be staying away from that cause inflammation, which so it's not heart healthy, but it's of course it's fat free, right? It's fat free, so heart healthy. But science is not settled. More and more, like I said, medical doctors are turning toward a more holistic approach. They're away from the medication, more lifestyle changes, and yeah, I think that's the way.
Okay,
the
can you
future.
explain the butter? Because I use butter too, but people think I'm crazy when I tell them to use butter.
Why do they think you're crazy?
Because that's what they believe. They believe that butter is bad for you, you know.
Yeah.
And which of course not all butter is the same. You know, you have butter that's not really butter,
Right.
and
right.
then you have butter that's from, you know, grass-fed, you know, cow with
Yeah, that's a
all
good.
the nutrients. But
That's a good point. You don't want overly processed any kind of fat, right? And you also don't want something that's like or olive oil. If it's not extra virgin olive oil, you can kind of assume that it might be cut with some vegetable oil.
Right.
But butter also has vitamin K, I believe, which is cleansing to the arteries when you're able to use it correctly, so K2. And butter's fine. Butter's perfect. So the whole mindset that saturated fat is unhealthy, and they've been told that butter's unhealthy, cut the butter out, is propelling that argument against you.
right.
So you cook with butter, and so does heat have any effect on it like it does on oils? Like
It does. So heat has an effect on any of these oils. If the more liquid it is at room temp, the lower the smoking point. The more solid at room temperature, the higher the smoking point. So you can cook at higher temperatures if it's a more solid oil at room temp.
so coconut oil is okay.
Coconut oil is good, yeah. You don't want it smoking though. If you're smoking,
Up to like 400 degrees or something like that, I think.
it's pretty good. Now if you're deep frying, I mean, either way, there's no healthy way to do that.
Air fryer. Just get
Just get an air fryer.
So butter is better if you're cooking it on high heat. It's better for it to be solid, right?
Well, nothing's going to be solid at high heat, right?
No, I'm saying like when you put it in the pan, is it going to be cold butter on high heat?
It doesn't matter. The butter is going to eventually heat up, right? But you don't want it so hot to where it starts smoking.
Okay.
Yeah. And if that happens, turn the vent hood on. Don't be breathing that in. That's
Right.
not something you want in your body, right?
So
Okay.
just
Yeah.
keep it on low heat as you cook or medium.
Right.
Yeah, as long as it's not smoking, you're pretty
Don't
good.
get in a hurry, in other words.
Don't get in a hurry. And I know a lot of people. I mean, if it's liquid at room temp, olive oil is okay. It's got a little bit higher of a smoking point. Assume that when you drink it and it's in your body, a little bit warmer, it's going to go rancid. Yeah, you can safely assume that. So, any more questions? All right. Dr. Mike's going to hop up, take over.
Okay, so the part that I'm going to cover is the oft counterproductive measures that we do medically, right? The things that we just do without thinking. Not a whole lot of them, but a couple of the big ones that you see right now. But you get the point is to show you the gist of how our thinking medically tends to be off kilter. And you can pretty much apply this to just about any practice, unfortunately. So while the medical system is typically quite good at diagnosis, right? We send people for diagnosis all the time. I don't have any issue with that whatsoever. They're really good at finding stuff. We must remember that it is based on a mechanistic view of health. It is not a holistic or a natural view of health. Okay, it's very mechanical in nature. This essentially means that the ability to acquire or maintain health is dependent on calculability and predictability of factors. That's it. Okay, so in other words, you have high blood pressure. They put you on a high blood pressure medication. What's the measure of if the high blood pressure medication is a good drug or not? Its ability to lower your blood pressure, right? So if it does what it says it's going to do in lowering your blood pressure, then they say it's a good drug, right? But it doesn't look into the factor, does it cause cancer 10 years down the road? Does it have other adverse effects? Does it kill your libido and cause you to need to be on Viagra now? It doesn't take any of these things into effect. So a drug is simply measured by, can it calculate and predict factors within your health? So in other words, your body is a machine and we're going to manipulate it. Okay, that's how the system works. This is seen in things such as normal ranges, right? As we talked about blood pressure, normal range blood pressure. I mean, if you take a soccer player that just got done playing 90 minutes and immediately put a blood pressure cuff on them, then they're going to die, right? Because their blood pressure is through the roof. Your heart rate is through the roof. I mean, why are you not dead right then and there? But they don't look at that. It's just normal ranges. Standard of care, right?
So you're saying like everybody has their normal range.
Yeah.
And not everybody's normal range is the same.
Exactly, and we don't look at factors. In fact, when we talk about normal ranges, a lot of the, kind of top cardiologists now tend to agree that 100 plus your age up to about 160 is normal blood pressure. So if you're 60 years old and your blood pressure is 160 over, 100 or whatever, that's fine. It's not a big deal. That is actually expected based on your physiology, as Dr. Jordan and Dr. Tiffany covered, right? All of those factors that come into play, lack of elasticity, lack of capillary beds in your muscles, all these different factors, it all plays into that. So your normal range should be higher, okay? But it wouldn't be normal if you were 20 years old, unless you're out running or, you're in the middle of an anxiety attack when you see the doctor.
Or bears chasing you.
Exactly, right? So we've got to look at these things, and all of these factors should come into play. But tell me, how can you get all of that when you've only been in the room with the cardiologist for 30 seconds? They walk in, they look at the tests and everything, that you just did, your blood pressure and all that, and then they say, okay, this is high, here's your medication, and walk out. How do we get to that, right? But this is the problem with standards of care,
is it's all based on just simple calculable numbers. That's what you get for healthcare. So even in sayings like it's the dose that makes the poison, right? This is a medical mantra. It's the dose that makes the poison. So it's not the drug is dangerous. It's only the drug in a certain volume that's dangerous. Where we would say a poison is a poison, right? Canola oil is a poison. You know, it's not okay if you only eat it in your salad dressing every day. You know, because you don't eat fried chicken every day, right? That doesn't make it any better, okay? When this model of thinking predominates, the expected outcome is a society of sick individuals forced into compliance with textbook data through artificial stimuli and suppressants. Okay, so all you're doing is taking a medication to either stimulate or suppress a function. Okay, the bottom line is the following are no exception and no solution. Drugs don't know normal. Think about that for a second. They don't know normal. All they can do is stimulate or suppress. They have no idea what normal is for you. There's no way to attain that. What's the only thing that knows normal? You, your body. It's called innate intelligence, right? Okay, so blood pressure drugs. The first thing we must remind is that medications is merely a more palatable word for what they are. Drugs. Drugs are drugs, right? Isn't it ironic that, you know, when our kids were in school, we all went through the Nancy Reagan, you know, campaign of don't do drugs, you know, and, you know, my kids even in school, you know, I don't know when the last time they got something was, but I remember them talking about it, and you know, and it was so hard. Right, it was so hard for me not to take their pen and like put a label over it that says don't do medications, right? Just to make all these kids think like, you know, medications, drugs, they're the same thing. It's just one is given from a black coat, one is given from a white coat, right? It's the color of the jacket that makes the legality, I guess. So drugs are only capable of two things, as I said, stimulate or suppress or inhibit. That's the only things that they do. They cannot do one of the anything outside of that. They either stimulate a function or they suppress it. Therefore, by nature, they are incapable of understanding nor promoting normal, as I said, right? They don't know normal. This should be a major consideration because that means everything that you do as far as testing goes, right? Anytime that you do a test that determines where your normal is, or I'm sorry, where your reading is, it's based on that immediate set of circumstances. So now you're getting put on a drug or, you know, a medication, right? You're getting put on a drug to either stimulate or suppress that moment in time. Well, how is that going to affect all the later moments in time, right? You know, so here you're in a state where your blood pressure is high momentarily for whatever reasons. You get put on a blood pressure medication. Then, as happens in our office, you know, the patient gets up off the table and they start, you know, waving around. Like, and I'm like, you know, why are you getting dizzy? You know, and it becomes apparent real quickly, they're taking a blood pressure medication. So, you know, now their body is in a state where it can't adjust to just basic functions because their blood pressure is artificially suppressed. So now they can't even get up off of a table or out of a chair without getting dizzy because their blood pressure is too low all the time because it was too high in that moment. Does that make sense? Okay. So as you've learned tonight, normal is a meticulously complicated process of regulating millions of factors simultaneously, a measure only able to be achieved by the incredible wisdom of innate intelligence. What is innate intelligence?
Your own intelligence.
Yes. Well, let's get real philosophical, right?
It's not the wall.
Let's get deep.
What's
Okay.
built in?
So, no, this is amazing chiropractic philosophy. Kenzie, what is innate intelligence?
She's like,
Don't put me on the spot.
It's the knowledge that is something. It's like it makes it what it is. It's like we know it is and it has its own function. Is that?
Yeah, somewhat, yes. So there's two different kinds of intelligence, right? I'm really putting people on the hook here. We just went through all of these like, a couple of weeks ago. So all this stuff is fresh. So you have two types of intelligence: universal intelligence and innate intelligence. So universal intelligence is a stuff that holds everything together, okay? So why is that chair a chair? And why did it stay a chair when I kicked it? Universal intelligence, okay? It's the glue, the fabric of the universe that makes everything maintain its form, okay? You could say it's the law of physics, or it's chemistry, it's biology, it's all of these factors that just hold everything together, planets and gravity and all that stuff. It's just universal intelligence. So if that's what's in everything, what's the difference between a living body and a non-living body?
Instincts?
Innate intelligence, okay? That's one way of looking at it, right? Some people would call it spirit. Some people would call it Holy Spirit. Some people, chiropractors, call it innate intelligence, right? There's a difference between something that is animate and something that is inanimate, okay? Innate intelligence is that thing that is only in living beings that makes it basically self-healing, okay? It's the world is destructive by nature, but innate intelligence is constructive by nature. Pretty cool stuff, right? So the only thing that is capable of dealing with these millions of factors simultaneously is that level of innate intelligence, that wisdom that we aren't capable of. You don't know, no doctor knows, no drug company knows how to calculate all the millions of reactions that are happening in your body at this moment. All they can do is grossly manipulate the whole system at once by either suppressing or accelerating, right? Stimulating. It sounds like a dangerous game when you put it that way, right?
Yeah.
So this is why we've got to take this stuff real seriously when we, it's okay in moments that you might need a medication for something. If you get your leg lopped off, you probably want morphine. If you're not allergic to it, right? But outside of that circumstance, is it good to be on morphine all the time?
Right.
Of course not, right? But why are we getting on lifestyle medications that we're supposed to just be on all the time and ignore physiology? It doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so looking at this, we basically dumbed this way down. Okay, now you can see it's great to have all the science behind it, because now you can just look at a very simple picture of this. Okay, what is this? Oxygen. Okay, so oxygen, where does that originate? In the air. I'm just joking. So you get it out of the lungs, right? There's something deep here. No, it's in the air. So the oxygen comes from your lungs, okay, and we've got to get the oxygen where? To the end tissues, okay? Your brain consumes at resting state how much of your body's oxygen? 85%. 85% of the oxygen that your body consumes in a resting state goes to your brain.
Wow.
That's stunning. Okay, think of that. That's like a computer, right? Where does most of the power go to run a computer or to run your phone? To the processor. It doesn't go to all the other stuff. I mean, the fan on the computer doesn't take that much power, right? It's the processor that consumes all the energy. So your brain is the processor of your body. That's what is consuming all of this energy all the time. And that energy comes from oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you can't make ATP. You can't make energy, right? So that's what drives this whole thing. So we got to get real simple: oxygen to the body. How do we do that? Through the circulatory system, through all those levels of respiration that we talked about. Okay, so of course these little blues, these are the oxygen going through. Okay, so this is in a normal state. All right, this is what it should look like. And of course, this is the cell wall. So if you take that and you do this, ooh. Okay, you guys saw what happened there, right? Do I need to play that again? No? Okay, they got thicker, right? So this is inflammation. Okay, Dr. Jordan covered all that, how thick those walls are. And there's lots of different tissues in there to inflame. But when you inflame something that is a tube, right, it doesn't just go outward. Where does it go to? Inward. So you just caused stenosis, or a narrowing of that canal. Okay, so let's take that back in reverse. You had the oxygen that you have to get a certain amount to the brain. You have to, right? In order to keep it working, you have to get a certain amount of oxygen to the brain. But you just narrowed the space to get all of that output. What do you have to do to rebalance the system?
Get rid of the inflammation?
Well, that would be the correct answer. But in this situation, you just narrowed the tube. What do you have to do to rebalance the output to this end?
More blood, or higher pressure.
Higher pressure, yes, exactly. Right? You increase the pressure, and you've got it on the other end. So another way of looking at this, okay, let's take it down another notch. You've got a fire on a building, okay, and the fire truck shows up, and they've got what? Their big, gigantic hose. Okay, so they get out there and they start dragging out their hose in order to put out this fire. And they hook up the hose to the fire hydrant, and they turn it on and realize, oh, someone cut the hose in half. Right? We got a problem now. So the neighbor, the lady across the street, says, it's fine, you can use my hose. You can use my hose. Right? So, I even have an adapter to it. Right? So they go and they screw a garden hose onto the fire truck. What's going to happen? Right? Nothing. But let's say it's a really, really darn good garden hose. It's really strong, and they could increase the pressure on it like a power washer, right? You increase the pressure enough, you can still push out a massive amount of water out the other end.
But it could also burst.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And kill everybody.
Yeah.
Right. But you get the point. That's how you adjust for these scenarios, is you increase pressure. Does your doctor ever talk about this stuff when they're prescribing blood pressure drugs?
Of course not.
No, they don't consider any of it. It's just, here's your drug. Oh, you're 128 over 84 and 65 years old. Oh, well, you're not 120 over 80, so here's your blood pressure drug. Like, it's mind-numbing when you really think about it. It's very frustrating. All right, so the root cause of increased blood pressure being increased demand, then how does it make sense to restrict demand? Because that's really what we're doing with the drugs. We're putting a damper on that demand on the other end. You can't now get enough oxygen to the other side because you're suppressing the pressure. Okay? So factors that must be considered. Is systemic inflammation reducing exchange capacity? Right? We talked about that. So systemic inflammation must be addressed. Is congestion of some kind reducing flow rate? Where does congestion come from? Talked about cholesterol, right? But it's not really the cholesterol. Again, it's inflammation. But it can be protein debris. It can be you've got a blood clot somewhere. So the congestion must be addressed. Is the pump mechanism itself underachieving? What is the pump mechanism? The heart, right? So are the end tissues demanding higher oxygen rates than provided? I mean, if you're exercising all the time, then obviously you're going to have a higher demand in the tissues. If you're healing, you're going to have a higher demand in the tissues. So all of these factors must be addressed. Systemic inflammation, what deals with that? Fish oils, B vitamins, reduce your inflammatories, okay? So we know fish oils reduces inflammation. If you guys have not seen the workshop on the Bs, which was... what was the workshop on the B vitamins? Systemic acidosis. Okay, on our YouTube channel, the workshop on systemic acidosis talks all about the B vitamins and how this works. Reduce inflammatories. That is things like medications. That is things like canola oil, or should we say rapeseed oil, right? All of these things are inflammatory by nature, sugars. If you don't deal with those things, you can't deal with systemic inflammation. All right? Congestion. Nattokinase, serozymes. These are the things Dr. Jordan was talking about, the nattokinase. The nattoserozyme particular formula is one that we use that breaks up protein debris in the arterial system. So, it basically, think of it like Drano for your blood. Does everybody need to take it? No. But a patient that has had a stroke recently, yes. If you've got known blood clots, yes. Even honestly, when people were when people had COVID and they had it bad and they were having breathing issues, probably not a bad idea to take nattokinase because it breaks up any of that protein sludge in their system so they can respiration easier, right? No, I'm not treating COVID by that statement. So reduce the indigestibles, like I said, that's the things. Indigestibles would be things like pork and canola oil and motor oil. That sounds terrible, but how many literally things that we eat are based on petroleum products? They're not even food. So these things are indigestible in the body. Yep.
Preservatives are also a big one.
Yep.
Things that are meant to be in our body.
Yeah, so all the stuff that cannot be broken down and digested. I mean, think about it for a second. You go to, I don't want to pick on any particular restaurant, but take your pick around here. I always joke that, if you want to have a successful restaurant in the South, sell fried chicken, right? Like that seems to be the formula. They're the longest lines everywhere. But doesn't it kind of make you freak out a little bit knowing that they've got these fryer vats that they put this oil in and they fry chicken in it all day long? And then at the end of the day, they turn it off. And the next morning, they turn it back on and they fry in it all day long. And that cycle repeats until they need to what? Add more oil, because where'd the oil go? In the chicken. It's in the breading and everything. So you're eating all of that stuff that has been fried in for days on end. It's crazy that we think that our body can digest that stuff. Yeah.
They actually do have to filter and clean the oil.
Yeah. Well, filter and clean, yes.
I mean, yeah, but it's still nasty.
Yeah. Yeah. That's probably more to get the flies out and the rat hairs and that, right? all that good stuff. I used to work at Hardee's way back in the day. Hardee's, they're not even Hardee's anymore, right? They're is it still Hardee's? Okay.
Here, somewhere.
Carl Jr.'s, yeah. They.
So where would you eat out if you were gonna eat out? Where would you eat out? Red Bar? No, but where else? I mean, where could you go? For
Honestly,
Red Bar?
We tend to.
Red Bar. That's what I said.
That's one option. We tend to eat more if we're gonna eat out. Honestly, it's 90% of the time we're eating ethnic foods. Ethnic foods like Indian, Thai, stuff like that, because they tend to use more vegetables and and not
And less crappy ingredients.
Yeah. American, yes, Mediterranean, Jerusalem Cafe, stuff like that. Is it perfect? No. I mean, I'm sure Jerusalem Cafe, and places like that still use regular stuff. Now, I will tell you, we're probably the only ones, Red Bar, that uses coconut oil on our grills. We don't even have canola oil in there, but we use, if you're grilling something, it's either butter, Kerrygold butter, or coconut oil.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, there is nothing else other than of course, the fat in the beef. So anyways, reduce the indigestibles, because if a fryer can't destroy it, your body can't, right? That's kind of the purpose there, is your body is not reducing things at 450 degrees. So pump function, exercise. It's real simple. That's how you improve the function of your pump. You use it, okay? Oxygen demand is exercise variation. Okay, if you just get on a treadmill and you walk every day, and it's the same thing every day, your body really doesn't have to try. So it adapts to that, and that's it. But if you vary your exercise and you do different things with different levels of demand, your body gets used to demand in different ways. And so really that variation helps things tremendously. All right. What do astronauts and Cpap users have in common?
They're both hooked to hoses.
They are.
Artificial breathing, kind of like.
Basically, yeah. I mean, you guys are on it. So basically, the astronaut and CPAP users, what they have in common is that both of them are using a device, are basically their bodies are being forced into a alternate environment, right? So in an astronaut's position, he's hooked up, and they're up in space where the conditions are completely different. You've got gravity changes and the oxygenation level changes, and even the air that they're breathing is completely different. So what happens? They have to acclimate to the environment. They have to stay on treadmills all day long just to try to stay alive and functional, because if they don't do anything and they go up into space, what happens when they come back down? They're diseased. They have all kinds of issues. They used to, before they did all of this stuff, they knew that astronauts were more likely to die once they come back because their bodies just couldn't acclimate to the environment. But that's what we're doing with all these CPAP machines too, is we're getting people used to an alternate environment by changing the way that oxygen consumption works. Okay? So CPAP's altitude training and Lance Armstrong. I love making just weird connections there. Okay, so think about this. Altitude training, if everybody doesn't know what this is a common practice amongst especially runners. What you do is, I'll tell you a story. When we were, that was back in February of 2021, I took my two oldest boys skiing in Colorado. And, we're from Mobile, right? So we're low sea level, and it's warm here. And so we get there, and when we walk out, it's like 6 degrees outside, or maybe it was -6. I don't know. It was cold, when we arrived there. But anyways, we're driving up a mountain in one of the parks. I think it was Colorado Springs, in one of the parks there, and the road was like treacherous. I mean, there was. I was driving so slow trying to get up it because it was just covered with ice. The car was sliding all over the place. My kids were nervous, like we're gonna die. But it was fun. It was neat. It was pretty, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But we're coming up the road, and all of a sudden this guy comes running past us up this, mountain road, and he's wearing nothing but a little pair of shorts like this, and running shoes, and a pair of gloves. That's it. That's all he had on. You should have seen how red he was. I mean, his chest and his face and everything was just bright cherry red. Like as red as that wall back there. But what was he doing? He was altitude training. He was altitude training in the bitter cold, but it was still altitude training. Okay, so what that is when you go up in the higher altitudes, especially up in mountains and such, the air gets lower, right? It gets thin. So why does that help you? If you're getting ready to run a race in New Orleans, where is New Orleans? Right, sea level. Actually, it's slightly below sea level, right? So you're getting ready to run the New Orleans marathon, the rock and roll marathon, whatever, and you have been training in high altitude. Your body is used to training in low oxygen levels. So now you go out to race in New Orleans, and what happens? You're going to kick tail because your body is used to running on very low amounts of oxygen. Okay, so you do very, very well in that environment. You also see the same thing with UFC fighters and boxers and football players and stuff. They put these oxygen deprivation masks on, right? So they put these masks on that restrict your oxygen intake, and it does the same thing. It reduces oxygen, so you're basically simulating the effect that you have here. What does Lance Armstrong have to do with either of those? Blood doping, okay? If you guys didn't know how this worked, he won, count them, 7 Tour de France's. How did he do it? Because they found later that what they were doing was they were removing blood out of his system before the races, okay? Like weeks in advance. They would store it in a cooler, and then the day before the race or the day of or whatever, they would take all that blood, they would bring it back to room temperature, and they would inject it all back into him. So because you're increasing the volume of your blood, you can now carry what? More oxygen. And so he was able to breathe way better than anybody else, and
That's extreme.
he just busted everybody else. It to me it sounds dangerous too, but
Yeah, that's crazy.
but it helped him win 7 Tour de France's until they found out what he was doing, and then they took him all away. All right. So CPAPs, what they do, this is obviously your lungs. It's not a sad person. This is your lungs, and this is your diaphragm right here. Okay. So when you breathe in, what happened? As Dr. Tiffany showed you, the diaphragm pulls down. As the diaphragm pulls down, it creates basically a vacuum force, right, in the lower abdomen, which causes air to be sucked in through the trachea at the top, right? It's just, think of it like it's just pulling the air in, and your rib cage expands and everything else. So air in as the diaphragm goes down. As the diaphragm relaxes and goes back up, what happens? The air goes back out. Okay, so think about this. If you increase the amount of available oxygen per breath, does the diaphragm have to work more or less? Less, right? Because the whole intent is to get a certain amount of oxygen incorporated into the environment. And use less muscle, right? It's all about efficiency. So if you're pulling in more oxygen because the air has changed, then you have to work less. All right? Next question then. If the diaphragm works less, does it get stronger or weaker? Weaker, right? Because it's not having to work. If you're used to lifting 20-pound weights and you drop it down to 5, are your arms going to get stronger or weaker? Weaker.
So you want your diaphragm weak?
No. Right?
Okay.
Let's back it up. Okay? So you're increasing, using a CPAP, you're increasing the oxygen in the air.
Right.
Okay? You're forcing air basically into the system in higher concentration. So each breath you're getting more oxygen, which makes it easier to breathe, which means your diaphragm doesn't have to work as hard. So the diaphragm actually gets weaker in the process. Okay? So, yep.
So it's not good to use the CPAP?
Hang on. We're halfway there.
Okay.
I won't tell you guys, I actually asked these questions to my 10-year-old. But I guess I just told you that I asked these questions to my 10-year-old. And he got them all, right? Kind of. Okay, I wanted to make sure all this was easy, right? If the diaphragm gets weaker,
Just made me feel stupid.
not at all the intent.
Thanks, I'm not coming back.
I just have a really smart 10-year-old, right? Okay, if the diaphragm gets weaker, does it make it easier or harder to breathe under normal conditions? Harder, right? Now exactly, your diaphragm is weak now because for 8 hours of the day, you've been using an artificial environment. So you're now weakening the diaphragm, so now it gets harder to breathe during the regular day, the other 16 hours of the day. Okay? So if it's harder to breathe, does that make you closer or further from homeostasis? Okay, what is homeostasis? For the record, my 10-year-old had no idea. Okay? Homeostasis, the Homeostatic Essentials, this is the condition in which your body is self-regulating. Okay, this is what you want. This is called health, when the body is self-regulating. So read that again. If it's harder to breathe, does that take you closer or further away from self-regulation? Further away. So now we answer the question, is the CPAP good for you or bad for you? It's a crutch. That's all it is. It's literally like think of it like you hurt an ankle, okay? And so your ankle hurts, so you don't want to put weight on it. So you get a pair of crutches. And so you walk around on the crutches for a few weeks. But what happens if you just keep walking on the crutches? You get weaker and weaker, except for your armpits. They get pretty, they get pretty numb. So, but your legs get weak. that's not a good thing, right? So the crutches were good in a situation, but the objective should always be to get out of that situation, right? That's the very definition of a crutch, is a temporary means to get you out of a situation.
So what did you do?
There you go.
Go for it. We're waiting.
Okay, so still think you need a CPAP. I hope you now realize that a CPAP is nothing but a crutch that absolutely makes you more dependent, therefore less healthy over time. Like we often ask patients, then for many drugs, etc., what is your exit strategy, right? If a patient is taking an antidepressant, I ask them, what is your exit strategy? Most of the time, they've never even thought about it. I mean, I'd say 90% of the time when I ask that question, they look at me like, well, I never thought about that. Like, and so my next question is, well, did you plan on taking it for the rest of your life? Like, is that the plan, to need a drug for the rest of your life? Like, we should be thinking these things. What is our exit strategy? So while a CPAP may be used on a temporary basis like you would an antibiotic, etc., it should not be considered a long-term solution. It's just not. But what we're in right now is an environment, especially, and this is why, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have even been talking about this stuff. It wasn't an issue, but it seems now everybody goes in for sleep studies. And what does a sleep study say? You stop breathing 1,800 times during the night. So every time a patient tells me I stopped breathing 1,800 times during the night, my next question is, well, how many times did you start breathing again?
Yeah, some people have dreams that they're drowning and they're not breathing because they're dreaming.
So, it's not really a desirable position to be in, where you're starting and stopping breathing and everything, but we got to look at what's causing that. That's really the problem. So the long-term solution is a holistic health program that addresses all 7 homeostatic essentials. Anything less will never achieve long-term health. It just puts off problems for another day in an often increasing manner, right? We're just putting off problems when we use crutches. So the objective should be to, like a recovering athlete, to get off those crutches and back running on the field as quickly as possible. How do you do that? Rehabilitation, right? That's the only way to do it, is you have to have a program that you follow to rehabilitate your body back to a state of proper function. What does that look like? It changes for every person. But if the point is this, and this is kind of a perfect place to sum it up, if you're not addressing all 7 of the homeostatic essentials, then you're not really healthy. You can't be, because that's the very definition of an essential. It's not a recommendation, it's an essential to living. Make sense? That's that. Does anybody have any questions?
So what does it look like for someone trying to get off a CPAP? They're just going to struggle to breathe?
Well, it depends. Again, a temporary crutch isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's designed to be a temporary crutch. So, if you can adjust the levels of it, then someone might say they start at a certain level, but they're immediately addressing the inflammatory issues and diet issues and exercise, and they have a program. And so now they can create a timeline that they're going to start weaning off to lower and lower levels with an eventual, point where they're going to get off of it entirely.
I feel like that goes for everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything that you just wean yourself off of it slowly.
I mean, if you have a torn up ankle or a broken leg, you can't just say, oh, this is a crutch, I'm better than this, and, throw it down, and now you're messing up your posture because you're throwing all on one leg.
Yeah.
Crutches are okay in situationals. We just have to remember in context, it's a temporary means. It was always meant to be. But unfortunately, like I said, we're now in this environment where they are selling these devices and making a killing off of them. The profit behind the whole CPAP industry is insane. So there, it's like this whole industry has come up by putting CPAPs on otherwise unhealthy individuals. It never answers the question, what do we get back to health? It's just a crutch.
They make retainers too for that, to sleep for the airway, because they said I had sleep apnea, but she said that my airway was too small, needed to lose weight.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
but I couldn't use the machine.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't even talk about it, but how pillows affect. Also, I mean, that's a whole nother level of it, because I mean, if you take someone that's laying on 2 pillows, and they're like this, what did she talk about? You can't use the upper parts of your lungs. So, I mean, how can you breathe? That also doesn't affect the brainstem, is a center of heart rate, rhythm, and respiration in the body. So if you're now compressing the brainstem, or you have subluxation of the brainstem because your atlas is out of whack, all these different factors go into you're not going to perform vital function sufficiently. Vital function is heart rate, rhythm, and respiration, the things that automate while you're asleep. You have no gauge. I mean, right now you could just say, okay, I'm going to start breathing deeper. I'm going to stand up straight. Can anybody do that while you're sleeping? You're left to whatever is working when you're asleep. That's why you have all these problems. But I mean, even changing your pillow makes a difference. And i.e. getting rid of your pillow. For all those who haven't yet.
Yes, we have.
Good. Any other questions?
I want to mention, doctors, we hire them, chiropractors included, and what they tell you should be counsel. It shouldn't be final word. And so always remember, you could seek out other opinions and other specifically medical doctors' opinions, because there's a growing resource of information that debates what's taught in schools now, and also don't hold medical doctors, in disregard, because they only know what they're taught, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they're taught by schools who a large amount of their funding is by those who profit from disease and lifestyle.
Pharmaceutical company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, like the 3 credit hours of nutrition that they get, which is not nearly enough, has been encouraged by those who profit off sick people.
And he's not misspeaking there. It's literally 3 hours. Yeah. It's not much. Any other questions? Any other questions for other docs either?
What were the things for inflammation? Fish oil?
Fish oils, B vitamins, and getting rid of the inflammatories. Yeah.
That would be, so people that are on medication for rheumatoid arthritis, that they don't, if they got on these, on particular, like the fish oil and all that, would that help them to come off of the?
I mean, that is so situational. It's so dependent on the individual, unfortunately. Like, I'll give you an example. A lot of these autoimmune conditions are set up by previous medications, chemical exposures, vaccines. So, if you had something earlier in life that caused damage to you, think of like, acne medication, damaging your liver. Right? I mean, we know all these things. So if you had something somewhere down the line that caused damage to a systemic process, well, then the result now is this condition or that condition. So can just changing one thing undo the damage that you've done? Unfortunately, no. In some cases, because our bodies are still, as beautiful as innate intelligence is, we're still bound by universal forces. We're still bound by universal intelligence. So the body has limits of anatomical integrity, meaning you can only do so much to it before there's a point of no return. And sometimes that doesn't take much.
Yeah. We'll say I have a buddy who's a chiropractor in Georgia, and he had a patient with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. And this individual patient was like really skinny. His knees were the size of coconuts. And the medical doctors were trying to fatten him up, so they were giving him like Ensure and other milkshakes and things like that. Well, the chiropractor took it upon himself to do a testing for food sensitivities, different than allergies, to see if he could find out why the body's attacking itself, right? Because rheumatoid arthritis, the synovial fluid is real thick. It's like toothpaste. And so eventually the joint wears away and fuses. So it turns out that the kid was having a food sensitivity to dairy. And the Ensure and the milkshakes and everything he was doing to help him gain weight, he wasn't...
Actually making it worse.
Yes, he wasn't able to properly digest. It was the proteins were getting into his blood, into the joints. The body was attacking the joints because it didn't recognize the specific protein.
Wow.
And so a lot of times it's about figuring out those certain triggers for your genes and then avoiding them, because through something called epigenetics, we can actually alter our gene expression.
Yeah.
And so that was the case for this child.
Yeah, because a lot of people will try to blame things on genetics, but it's not necessarily the case, because, I mean, it's like diabetes. If everybody in your family has diabetes, but you grew up on Debbie cakes and McDonald's, yeah, you're gonna, and you continue to eat like that, yeah, you're gonna get diabetes. But it starts in your kitchen. It starts in your living room. You make those changes, you won't get diabetes.
Well, one of you, I can't remember, we were talking about this a couple weeks ago, genetics and epigenetics. But the thought in epigenetics is that your genes put the bullet in the chamber, but your environment and what you take in and put on your body is what pulls the trigger.
Yep. Yep.
Any other questions? Comments? Nope. All right. Well, awesome. Thank you guys for coming.